And by the way, when I mean eliminating underage gambling, I'm not meaning eliminating bad parenting. There is no excuse for bad parenting.
With online gaming, all the elements take place on the internet, cyberspace, as opposed to online betting where the elements takes place elsewhere.
This is bringing in number betting in South Africa is 70%, up to 70% of a bookmaker's revenue, because our return to player is far larger than the national level.
Good morning. It is my pleasure and honor and privilege to be here this morning to welcome everyone to the Annual International Association of Gaming Regulators Conference, IAGR. This conference was put together by your board of directors and a number of committee members working together with the host jurisdictions, the GGB, and all of the South African provinces to bring this event to you. I'd like to take a moment right now and introduce your current board of directors, those who are present here at the conference. And I'll begin with Mr. Nick Toffler from the UK, Trude Elde from Norway, Birgitte Sand from Denmark, Audrey Robinson from Jamaica, Becky Malambo from South Africa, Mabuto Zwane from South Africa. I think we've covered most of those who are here. Have I missed anyone? There are a number of trustees. Our board consists of 14 trustees. We have 7 of them here today this morning. Mr. Fortune Sekapane is not able to be here today, but he will be around. One of the reasons I wanted to introduce the board to you, because as I mentioned, this is a member-driven organization. Now, back in 2011, we held our first conference as an independent organization in Cape Town, South Africa. And that was under the leadership of Mr. Sarobi Maja, who is IAGR patron and the first president of IAGR. I remember that conference very well. Mr. Sarobi Maja, with his big smile, welcomed everybody, sense of humor, and he set the tone. We had 178 delegates there. And I said that was our first conference as an independent organization. It really set the tone for all the future conferences. We had a huge financial success, in large part due to the generosity and hospitality of the South African nation. And it's continued to this day. We're a very successful organization, and we're driven by the members and especially by the host jurisdictions. The GGB and all of the South African provinces were extremely generous with their assistance support, both in terms of staff, in terms of financial support. The reception last night was hosted by the GGB. The golf on Sunday was hosted by the GGB. And we thank them profusely. It is, again, because of their generosity, we remain a strong, viable organization. We think we put together a great program, and I hope you enjoyed this week. We've got some really good sessions coming up today on new technology. If those of you who were out there saw the Bitcoin lottery that Tina Thacker-Rankin is putting together for a presentation this afternoon, we've got some great new things coming forward. As our conference theme suggests, we're trying to recognize tomorrow's challenges by acting today. And I think we have a full week in store, or a full couple of days in store for you. I'd encourage everybody, though, to please keep with the times on the conference program. Come back at the start times, and I'm going to ask the moderators and presenters to please stay within the guidelines. We have a very full conference if you've looked at the agenda, and we have to keep things moving along. Having said that, now I'll turn the mic back over to Mr. Maja, and we'll continue with our program. Thank you very much, and again, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dale Fugger, for the remarks that you made. May I also add, as he rightly pointed out, the first conference was held in Cape Town under my leadership, but I wasn't alone. May I also introduce the 2 veterans that I've seen here. Mr. Adre Velsenach, he's a veteran of this association. And Mr. Atul Hammer, may you rise, sir. Together with me, we are veterans. Let me invite the chair of the Gauteng Gambling Board, Mr. Zwane, to welcome us all to Gauteng, to Johannesburg. A round of applause for him.
Thank you, Program Director, the veteran of gambling in South Africa. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, members of IAGRA, and all industry players. I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the Gauteng Gambling Board, which is hosting this on behalf of all gambling boards in South Africa. That is the 9 provincial gambling boards, including the National Gambling Board. So we are hosting in Johannesburg, but hosting as South Africa. So this is a South African hosting, and it also represents the African hosting. We've mentioned yesterday, I think, the numbers that we have in terms of jurisdictions that are represented in this conference. It's very exciting. We have 18 jurisdictions from Africa. We have 16 jurisdictions from Europe, 14 from South America, 5 from Asia, Oceania, and the Caribbean. We have from North America about 18. So all in total, we have 69 jurisdictions attending this conference, representing the industry. I'm saying, regulators, you are here, please participate and contribute to what's the theme, which has been good, has been chosen very eloquently to take us through, that we want to prepare for the future, but doing it today. Preparing a better tomorrow, we have to do it today. We're not waiting for tomorrow for us to be able to do that.
Thank you very much. I'm going to then call on the keynote speaker, Dan Hua, who will then address us on avoiding boom and bust in gambling regulation. May we please welcome him to the podium with a very good round of applause.
So good morning. My name is Dan Waugh. I'm a partner in a consultancy called Regulus Partners, which provides strategic advice for the gambling industry, both for regulators, operators, and other parties involved in the industry. I'm also chairman of a charity called YGAM, which provides youth education around the risks of gambling, particularly to teachers in Great Britain, to raise their awareness of the issues. So I'm going to talk a little bit this morning about some of the challenges facing gambling regulators as I see them. I'm going to start with some personal reflections on whether the current processes for regulatory recalibration are sufficiently agile to address a fast-changing industry. So the traditional way of regulating gambling was to hold a review, reset the legislation, and then enforce, come what may. Governments tend not to like to get their hands dirty with gambling regulation. It is messy, it is fiddly, and in most jurisdictions around the world, it's simply not that important from an economic point of view. The historic cycle of regulation and re-regulation may not have been perfect, but it seemed to do the job, both in terms of addressing changes in supply and in reflecting societal desires and concerns. Yet I would contend that the old model of regulatory review and recalibration is no longer fit for purpose. It results in a cycle of boom and bust as issues are allowed to accumulate until the system starts to creak. Following belated realization that there is something wrong, there is often then a protracted process to modernize regulations, which gets bogged down in politics. And by the time the new legislation is launched, it's often already out of date. So, what's keeping you awake at night? I think it's fair to say that gambling in 2017 has its fair share of issues. I'm going to run through 4 areas which I think demonstrate the need for responsive and contemplative regulation. First, how is the internet changing your world? Whether yours is a prohibitionist jurisdiction or an open door or shades in between, online gambling will, I suspect, be forcing you to think long and hard. Second, I want to touch on the challenge to Reno model orthodoxy and how this may be changing the way that we perceive the role for regulators. Third, public health litigation in Australia and Canada and what that means both for operators and for regulators. And then finally, just a quick touch on some of the other stuff that's coming down the track. So, how has the internet changed your world? 23 years ago, something fairly significant happened. The first online casino was launched. The event presaged significant disruption to the established gambling order and continues to do so today. It created access and competition in gambling on a scale hitherto not witnessed, putting cross-jurisdictional challenges on an entirely different footing, and generally giving governments and regulators an almighty headache. Even today, almost a quarter of a century on from the start of online gambling, it is questionable whether anyone has truly got a grip on what this means in terms of regulation. The initial instinct of most governments has been to prohibit, but over the course of time, an increasing number have chosen to regulate. Sometimes positively in response to consumer choice, sometimes negatively in response to threats of litigation or fears of economic leakage. Largely as a result of the defensive response of governments, the remote gambling sector grew up outside the mainstream in small, technologically astute economies, often offshore. For the large part of its existence to date, online gambling has been regulated on a point of supply basis, where the benefits have been largely imported and the costs largely exported. This has created some challenges as we shift away from point of supply towards point of consumption. For starters, where should we look for the regulatory expertise? Simply replacing an offshore approach with an onshore approach may not be the answer. The experience in Great Britain is instructive. Among the larger economies, Britain has been one of the most tolerant regimes in the world for online gambling. The activity has never been illegal, and prior to 2014, we didn't even require operators to be licensed by our Gambling Commission. In the less than 3 years since the initiation of point of consumption licensing, the British Gambling Commission has unearthed a whole range of issues connected with online gambling that had simply not been raised under the old point of supply arrangement. So as we look to license and regulate the activity, where do we go to for our expertise? Moreover, as additional jurisdictions move over to regulation, and thus a larger part of the industry is subjected to analysis and study, what insights will we discover about the social and economic costs arising from online gambling? In markets with the highest penetration of internet that have prohibited, severely restricted, or just failed to address online gambling, critics argue that large black and grey markets have grown up. Of course, because they are black and grey, we cannot know their scale. In regulated markets, the jury is still out on the remote sector. The worst fears associated with online gambling, that its accessibility and lack of supervision would lend itself to an escalation of harm and greater vulnerability to criminal activity, appear not to have been manifested. In some of the most developed jurisdictions, Great Britain and Australia are very good examples here, public concern over online gambling is focused more on the way it is marketed than on the products themselves. Indeed, it seems plausible that the account-based nature of play may exert some positive influence over some gamblers, compared with the anonymity of cash-based gambling. Moreover, while it's popularly argued that every smartphone and laptop is in effect a slot machine, this is not the consumer experience. A smartphone is designed for many things, but slots and roulette are a long way down that list. An EGM, by contrast, is designed for one thing and one thing alone. You cannot make a phone call from one. They make lousy cameras, and your daughter or niece would struggle to watch Peppa Pig on one, assuming they're allowed on the gaming floor, of course. The point is that land-based gambling is designed to be immersive in a way that online gambling perhaps can never be, even with the trade show staple of 2007, virtual reality. When Khalil Philander discovered a link in the British Gambling Prevalence Survey between online gambling and lower rates of problem gambling severity, he suggested that this may be due to the fact that people were playing in environments which involve natural interruptions, the end of a bus journey, your wife coming home, the call of parental duties, or simply other entertainment options such as TV. Of course, for some people, the ability to gamble unsupervised may not be a good thing. Recent research in Great Britain identifies significantly higher rates of problem gambling during late-night play, something that is consistent with research on land-based gambling. There may be some selection bias here, but it's also intuitive that there'll be fewer distractions in the early hours of the morning. Something else that we should be concerned about is omni-channel gambling, and not simply because it is a particularly inelegant piece of industry jargon. At one point we had online gambling, then we had multi-channel gambling, now we have omni-channel gambling. I'm not sure what superlative the industry will come up next, but the point here is that companies, where the legislation permits, are increasingly talking about an always-on multimedia world of gambling. The customer plays in the casino, on the way home in the taxi, he carries on playing on his smartphone, and when he gets home, he flips open his laptop and carries on. In truth, I suspect this particular scenario happens rarely. Nevertheless, what I've described here is the wet dream of many gambling executives. Those customers who do engage with multiple channels tend not only to be the most valuable customers in aggregate, they are also often likely to be the most valuable across each channel. What is more, the industry isn't hiding this. Executives are being very open about it, which suggests they may perceive no problem with it themselves. So should we be worried? Possibly. The fact that omni-channel sits at the heart of strategy for many companies should alert us to the possibility of an increase in heavy usage of gambling, something which may indicate harm. What is more, we know hardly anything about the effects of omni-channel play. We do, of course, know that participation in multiple forms of gambling is correlated with harm, but we have not studied the behavioural effects at the individual gambler level of omni-channel gambling. Over recent years, researchers have carried out a number of fascinating studies using loyalty card or online account data to identify potentially harmful patterns of play, yet these have been carried out on a discrete basis, looking in turn at specific products, chiefly EGMs and online. What is missing are studies of the gambler and their behaviour across multiple formats. This feels like an important omission in the research literature. So online gambling has changed the world of gambling in very direct terms. There is also a very big indirect series of effects that I will now turn to. Often, where online gambling has been accommodated within legislation, the reforms are largely restricted to the remote channels themselves. The traditional land-based industries are largely left as they are. This is understandable. After all, any form of gambling expansion is politically difficult and messy. A decision to legalise online gambling is more often than not a decision to expand gambling, so why invite more trouble? The answer is that online changes everything. It shatters the old oligopolistic model of supply that has characterised much of land-based gambling. In the old days, the licence to operate was a licence to print money. The supply of gambling was restricted, and this in turn created markets that could be highly lucrative for operators and relatively easy to oversee for regulators. With the advent of remote gambling, that started to change. In some ways, this is just part of the change that we're seeing in commerce more generally, with Amazon's effect on retail and television, Expedia's terminal effect on travel agents, and so on. However, what marks it apart is the often unwitting connivance of governments, which fail to modernise land-based gambling, and so leave the traditional industry exposed to a competitor often less trammelled by regulation. It seems obvious that the response for land-based gambling should be to compete on experience rather than transaction, but often the opposite happens. The response of many traditional gambling companies has been to seek to make their venues more like online gambling, and this is meant to push for greater numbers and harder automated gambling products. Other impacts may include reduced staffing in order to save costs and closures of outlets. The fact that in Great Britain, perhaps the most advanced online gambling market in the world, land-based gambling in the form of casinos, betting shops, arcades and bingo clubs is in retreat is no coincidence. The migration of gambling from licensed venues to remote devices is likely to have negative consequences in terms of costs and benefits to consumers and governments. So, what happened in Reno? As you may be aware, the world of gambling academia has been rocked this year by a spat between two different groups of researchers. Through a series of articles published in journals, a debate has been raging across the academic community on how to best address gambling's costs. The argument centres on the rejection by Linda Hancock and Gary Smith of the old Schaffer, Blazinski and Ladouceur Reno model, which has represented orthodox thinking on harm reduction and the role of regulation over the last decade and a half. Hancock and Smith contend that the Reno model, which places an emphasis on the primacy of individual responsibility, has encouraged, and I quote here, slack policies and leaves gambling companies largely immune from accountability. I shan't go into the debate here, and I have no wish to add my own views to what is a pretty vexed discussion in the academic community. The excellent Paul Del Fabro of Adelaide University, who has contributed perhaps the most balanced commentary on the debate, is here this week, and I'm sure will be willing to share his views. It is worth pointing out that the role of the regulator is part of this debate. And you'll see from the quote on the slide here from Jim Orford, who's a professor of psychology at Birmingham City University, has claimed that the Reno model is representative of a cosy collaborative relationship between regulators, governments and operators that threatens effective responsible gambling. So the regulator is in the crosshairs of this debate. This seems excessive, but a departure from the ascendancy of the Reno model does pose some interesting challenges for gambling regulation. In particular, we should consider why, when gambling has been expanding globally and expenditures have been shifting to higher risk products such as EGMs, table games and their online equivalents, rates of problem gambling, we are told, have been in decline. It feels to me that this should prompt critical inquiry. In particular, we should consider whether problem gambling prevalence, as measured by a large-scale survey questionnaire, is the best way to understand harm. The debate is gradually shifting away from problem gambling prevalence towards actual manifestations of harm. Public policy debates around abstractions such as problem gambling are one thing. Discussions centered on bankruptcy, criminogenic gambling, divorce rates, abuse and suicide are something else. And these represent choppy waters for both gambling companies and regulators. The Reno model argument acts as a bridge to my next question about what might keep you awake at night. In Hancock and Smith's article, the authors argue that the Reno model has been complicit in allowing gambling operators to create deceptive and misleading gambling products and predatory practices. And this takes me neatly to Addiction by Design. So this, of course, was Natasha Schull's 2012 book, which alleged that harm is central to electronic gaming machines rather than incidental. Since she published that work 5 years ago, we've seen increased research into the causes of problem gambling, and in particular studies of how the brain responds to the stimulation of gambling. It may be partly as a result of this that gambling now finds itself on trial in both Australia and Canada. There is a long history of litigation linked to gambling-related harm, with a high number of high-profile cases settled out of court in North America. But in recent years, we've seen a shift in the nature of the litigation from failures of duty of care by the operators to protect clearly vulnerable customers to a focus on public health concerns about the design of products. Last month, the federal court in Melbourne heard the case of Shanika Guy versus Crown and Aristocrat. This guy, who claims to have suffered from a gambling addiction for 14 years, is suing the casino group and machine manufacturer over allegations that the machines contain deceptive features, losses disguised as wins, manipulated near misses, and misleading information on return to player. Just the items that Hancock and Smith rail against in their Reno model attack. Meanwhile, a class action is waiting to go to court in Newfoundland and Labrador, with allegations that the Atlantic Lottery Corporation exposed customers to misleading features on video lottery terminals, and that these features contributed to their addictions. So how will this end? We don't know, but the fact that these cases have come or are coming to court may in itself be significant, in that it indicates that the claims are not perceived to be spurious. In the event that the claimants lose, then it seems unlikely that we have heard the end of this. However, if the claimants secure any form of victory, then A, it may require some form of regulatory change, and B, it may ask questions of the regulator and the functioning of the market. But pretty much everything that I've mentioned so far should be characterized as familiar issues. This is not new news. These are matters that have been developing over a period of time. The itinerary for this conference, this excellent conference, is filled with exciting presentations and panel discussions on some of the new stuff that's coming down the track. I list some of the more obvious ones here: social gaming, daily fantasy sports, esports, skin betting, daily fantasy esports, the long-term impacts of mobile, which I think we've yet to glimpse, and virtual currencies. For the past 3 years, I've chaired a charity in Great Britain which helps teachers and those who look after children to better understand the risks of youth gambling. We hear from them increasing concern about what they term gambling, but which may not be technically classified as such in relation to harm to children. So should we be concerned about whether a new product technically is gambling, according to existing definitions, or whether it warrants the same level of oversight as gambling? In addition, one thing that's been developing recently is the question of cross-jurisdictional regulatory support, where operators may be warned off one jurisdiction by the regulator of another. The case of New Jersey and Australia illustrates this point. At the same time that these changes are taking place, research is likely to cast more light on the nature of gambling and problem gambling, crime, and other matters that warrant the regulator's attention. So this is the Wizard of Oz moment. This is the point at which you realise that I came here promising solutions but only reminded you of your problems. In my defence, this stuff is complicated. Moreover, each regulatory body here faces different challenges in their markets, so they're unlikely to be easy, simple, one-size-fits-all solutions. But before we get into questions, here are my top 5 half-baked ideas. First, online gambling causes significant market disruption. As you consider your policies towards it, whether prohibitionist or opening market, make sure you consider the effect of the online market on gambling as a whole, and do not do it in isolation. 2, encourage your governments to be open and clear about policy objectives. They should define what they want their gambling industry to be rather than simply what they don't want it to be. Without this clarity, regulation can quickly lose its way. 3, develop an evaluation framework that will allow you to know whether you are succeeding. Problem gambling prevalence studies are likely to form only a part of such a framework. 4, give yourself the advantage of your own expert and, to the extent that it is possible, independent research base to inform policy decisions. Try to avoid policy making by public and industry clamour. 5, build in mechanisms that allow you to review the effectiveness of regulation with regard to policy objectives before issues become too vexed to deal with or too big to fail. And that's the end of my quick canter through issues. I don't know if we want to take some questions now.
Yeah, we still have some 15 minutes if you have questions or comments to make. And I would suggest that as you do that, introduce yourself and tell us where you come from. Because we don't want to be answering questions from delegates from non-existent countries.
Hello, Dan. Thank you very much. Christina Rankin. Can I ask you my general view, and I'm a customer first, then operations, and then looking at regulation and law enforcement. Do you actually think interactive online digital gambling can ever be effectively prohibited? Personally, I don't. I think if China, North Korea, Iran have challenges controlling their digital borders, I think it's very hard for a normal state to do that. Be interested to see what you think.
Thank you, Christina. Just so you're aware, last night Christina told me she was going to heckle me this morning. So I don't think that qualifies as heckling, but anyway, good question. Prohibition, never say never. We don't know what people are capable of from a technological point of view, so never say never. I think prohibition is difficult. But if it is the decision of the government to prohibit, that's their license. And I suppose the question is whether prohibition requires complete cessation of all activity or simply cessation of the majority of the activity. I think if you have prohibition that doesn't work, that's problematic.
Yes, sir, over there.
I thank my colleague for deferring to me on this occasion. Graham Reeves from New Zealand. just regarding the Reno model, with the recent awarding of the Nobel Prize in Economics to Richard Thaler on the topic of basically libertarian paternalism, which we may discuss a bit tomorrow as well. I believe that emphasis, in the light of that, I should think. I'm just wondering on your view about that. I'm sure you're aware of Richard Thaler's work. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think actually, it's interesting, I think, because obviously Danny Kahneman has been involved in the same behavioural economics, and he did quite a lot of studies around gambling. He's done talks in Vegas, basically to argue that the probability is the law of gambling. It's statistical laws of probability don't exist in real life because we're weird and messed up. I think the whole sort of nudge theory area is fascinating. I don't think enough's been done in that area, and it's probably incumbent on operators to do more there. There's been some sort of interesting attempts at nudges in Great Britain at the moment, where we have a fairly fractious debate around EGMs in betting shops, and there was an attempt to nudge consumers to better behaviour by requiring them to register for play above a certain threshold, and the research tended to indicate that didn't work. But I'm not really sure that was so much a nudge. That feels like a bit of a shove, personally. So I think nudge theory could be tremendously powerful, and I think giving people positive inducements to exercise greater control of their play is likely to be superior than telling them to gamble responsibly or any of these sort of platitudes we hear. So I think it's exciting. I don't think the industry's done enough in that field, and whether the awarding of the Nobel Prize to Richard Thaler makes that happen, I don't know. I mean, it feels like this research field has been around for quite a while. I'm pretty sure, and Nick may tell me I'm completely wrong here, but I think that we've had a nudge unit in 10 Downing Street for probably about the last decade, and I think the Gambling Commission in the UK is now doing some work with them. That's all. You have to ask Nick about the details, but yeah, good question, and I think that's right.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Presenter, the issue is about, on the Reno model, operators become immune. Is the problem with the law, weak laws, or lack of reinforcement system, or there are certain things that perhaps need to be regulated, perhaps as a way to protect those that are coming in the process, and they are not being taken care of, or maybe they are duping the whole process. Is it the immunity? Is it becoming because of the weakness of the law enforcement system, or perhaps there are certain problems, and what can best be done?
Okay, and on the whole Reno model debate, I'm just sort of relaying some of the key arguments in personal judgment. But I think the comment around immunity was that the suggestion that, and let's be clear, the Reno model isn't law. It doesn't colour the way that gambling is carried out in all parts of the world, but it has been fairly influential. And I think what Hancock and Smith argue is that the Reno model has, by placing an emphasis on the primacy of responsibility of the individual gambler, it has allowed the industry off the hook. So the industry has been allowed to get away with responsible gambling communications, or the whole area of informed choice. We will tell customers what they need to know about the products, and then it's up to them to use them responsibly. And so Hancock and Smith argue that that's created some level of immunity from really tackling harm in a more robust fashion, whether it's through, by basically putting harder parameters around how gambling should be offered to consumers. So I think that's the immunity point that they would argue.
Any questions from the far right?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have a question. My name is Mike. I'm from an operator called Gold Rush in South Africa. I had the privilege of also being a regulator for a very long time. But I want to make a comment that's quite controversial. With privacy laws in South Africa, and I'm sure many countries, many jurisdictions that are attending today have privacy laws, individual privacy laws. You can only go so far to intervene when it comes to a person you perceive to have a gambling problem. On occasions when you try and interact with them, it meets with extreme dissatisfaction from the customer. Unless the customer turns to you for assistance in a land-based environment, little or nothing can be done from your side unless they turn to you. You can't go and tap anyone on the back. Switching machines on and off for time off, having a card system like the Lotto in Holland and things like that, where you can possibly time a player out, won't do anything. Because for a problem gambler, you'll climb in a taxi, I don't want to say an Uber, because my car could be stoned. You can climb in a taxi, you go 20 kilometers down the road, which is about 14 miles, you go to another casino and you start over again. So if you're a problem gambler, you'll go in a circle amongst the casinos and you'll keep gambling. So the whole thing, it's a bit of a fallacy. When we offer training on responsible gambling, we offer it to the staff to be able to identify people that may have a gambling problem. We pride ourselves in doing that. But you can't really tap a person on the back and say to him, I think you've been playing here long enough, because you don't know what his circumstances are, you don't know what his financial situation is. And then it comes back to people making remarks about weak regulation, weak operators, non-caring, wanting to steal from the public, which in my opinion is all a load of hogwash. If a person turns to us, as any jurisdiction will attest, if a person turns to us for assistance, there's legislation, a self-exclusion program that assists in helping the person exclude themselves from gambling. And we pride ourselves in that. But that's about as far as we can go. And it doesn't matter how much research is sponsored by whom, the results will ultimately be the same. Thank you.
Look, I'm sympathetic. I think harm minimization is complex and difficult. I think we have to bear in mind that we should be considering around this in terms of the situational characteristics of gambling, the structural characteristics of the games, and the personal characteristics of the people involved. And I agree. I mean, going up to a customer who may be gambling, actually in particular if they're experiencing some sort of distress, is very difficult for staff. I suppose, so there's a balance. There's a balance between the responsibility of the consumer themselves, there's a responsibility for the regulator and the government, there's a responsibility for operators. And I suppose we should all be challenging ourselves to do more. There's a lot of work going on at the moment around big data, the development of algorithms that might help to identify early on harmful patterns of play, and I think it leads back into the point about nudge theory. Are there things that we can identify problematic patterns of play early and to provide interventions that may nudge people away from a particularly harmful pattern? So I'm not sure. I think there is more we can do, and we should always have a curiosity about this. And I think the curiosity will hopefully drive us to be better. But it is complex, and there are no easy answers, and there's no one solution.
Thank you. Let me take this opportunity to invite the MEC for Economic Development, Environment and Tourism of the Gauteng Province, Mr. Mahile. A good round of applause for it.
I want to start by acknowledging the presence of the President of IAGRA, the Chairperson of the Gauteng Gambling Board, and the CEO. Also acknowledge the regulators that are here, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of our government, the government of Gauteng, which is the industrial heartland of our country. I am pleased to welcome you to Gauteng. It fills me with a great sense of appreciation and pleasure to be with you this morning. I would like to thank IAGRA leadership most sincerely for agreeing to organize this important conference in our province. Gauteng is a vibrant province with a rich history and numerous internationally recognized tourist attractions. The pre and post conference tours that I hope have been planned for you will highlight our rich political history, unique culture and arts, combined with the breathtaking natural beauty of our country. I urge you to visit Soweto, the melting pot of South African urban culture. Your visit to Soweto will undoubtedly underscore the role of Gauteng as one of the world's most popular tourist destinations. We hope this experience will provide a wonderful forum for our international guests to refresh their knowledge base, to explore the innovations much needed in the gambling industry. I want to encourage every delegate to take a little extra time to enjoy the spectacular and unique beauty of this province. Let me also thank the conference organizers for the excellent manner in which they have organized this important gathering. The Gauteng Provincial Government, through the Gambling Board and Gauteng Tourism Authority, submitted a bid to host this conference because we firmly believe in collaboration with key international institutions such as IAGRA. The hosting of conferences of this nature is part of our Gauteng tourism strategy. IAGRA plays an important role of facilitating information exchange, debate, and operational cooperation amongst gaming regulators. It is important for regulators to continue the close collaborations and networks in order to become better in what they do. This conference provides all of us with a golden opportunity to collaborate and share information about regulatory enforcement and supervision, technological developments within the gaming industry, illegal gambling, and social safeguards. The theme of this conference, as you all know, is recognizing tomorrow's challenges by acting today. And this clearly reflects our desire to ensure robust regulatory systems that is keeping pace with an evolving gaming industry. This is very important to ensure that we maintain public confidence in the gambling industry. We need regulatory systems that can help ensure fair play for the consumer and protect our gambling industry from money launderers and other criminal syndicates. However, in enforcing public policy, we must be careful not to stifle new ideas and frustrate innovation efforts in the industry. We must continue to review our legislative frameworks to ensure that we keep up with the technological evolution within the gambling industry. An outdated regulatory framework is bound to stifle growth and promote the mushrooming of illegal gambling activities. We are pleased that in Gauteng, our gambling industry has continued to grow from a revenue perspective despite our stringent regulatory compliance requirements. Gross gambling revenue for casinos, limited payout machines, bingo and betting totaled 26 billion in 2015, as an 11.2% increase on the prior year, with casinos retaining their majority share of the market, with gross gambling revenue of 18.2 billion. Sports betting remains very popular with consumers, which resulted in the betting industry's gross gambling revenue increasing by 28.5% over the prior year. The economic weight of the gambling industry in Gauteng and South Africa at large makes the transparent and accountable regulation of the industry particularly important. The gambling industry contributed 974 million to Gauteng's provincial government revenue in the year 2016-17 financial year. We are currently looking at various ways of optimizing the industry's revenue collection. This includes introducing a new tariff structure and reviewing taxes for the industry. We believe that the gambling industry can play a more meaningful role in injecting resources and increasing opportunities for income generation in townships. Greater emphasis must be placed on black ownership in the industry, skills development, small business development, and the growth of township enterprises. Because this conference takes place in Africa, we hope that you will also look at how the gambling industry can help extricate Africans from their conditions of underdevelopment, marginalization, and economic exclusion. The World Community of Nations has recognized the fact that one of the central and urgent challenges facing humanity is the eradication of poverty and underdevelopment. It is imperative that the decisions we take during this conference should fully reflect the desire to end poverty. I am confident that through this conference and the other work ahead of us, we will be able to move in unison towards the achievement of these common goals. Indeed, the creation of an inclusive gambling industry is in the best interest of the majority of humanity, because most of the peoples of the world, especially from the developing countries, are confronted by the challenges of exclusion in the context of the global economy. As the Gauteng provincial government, we are determined to do everything possible to achieve transformation in the gambling industry as part of our efforts to defeat the twin scourges of poverty and underdevelopment. In 2016, for example, the Gauteng Gambling Board issued 34 new bookmaker licenses to applicants who were required to meet strict broad-based black economic empowerment shareholding requirements. Applicants from the new bookmaker licenses were required to have 51% shareholding by previously disadvantaged individuals, of which 60% must be held by locals. Other requirements included the ring-fencing of 30% of the 60% shareholding held by locals for the benefit of black women and youth, because we know that youth unemployment is a big problem, not just in our country, but the world over. This is a step in the right direction, in line with the priorities set out in our provincial government program of transformation, modernization, and reindustrialization. Regulators must continue to place greater emphasis on black ownership in the gambling industry, promote small businesses development, and growth of township enterprises. We also urge the gambling industry to continue promoting responsible gambling practices to minimize the impact of problem of gambling in our communities. Priority must also be placed on social investment initiatives for the elderly, youth, and people living with disabilities, in line with the provincial government plans to transform and increase the poor shares of the economy. In conclusion, Chairperson of the Gambling Board and the President of Viagra, I have been informed that Gauteng Province now holds the title for the hosting of the highest, we hold the title for hosting the highest record number of delegates attending IAGRA annual conference. This conference has registered in excess of 269 delegates from various countries representing 69 jurisdictions. This is the highest number since the first IAGRA conference held in Cape Town in 2011. The highest number to be registered by IAGRA was 220 in Norway. And I think this demonstrates that this conference is growing in leaps and bounds. And we want to wish you well in your deliberations and in your future endeavors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable MEC, for the kind remarks that you made. We are indeed proud. And a round of applause for that. I said you needed to sustain it. Thank you very much. They are now going to address us on the changes in the Panta profile and the possible impact to the gambling regulatory landscape in Africa. We'll perhaps start with Mr. Edward Lalumbe, followed by Shelton Pajiwa. Basically, you had 1 hour. Now, I don't think you need that. It's too much. Otherwise, you are going to run out of ideas and become an embarrassment to yourselves. So please, 15 to 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes, after which we'll take some few comments and break for tea.
Thank you.
A round of applause for Edward Lalumbe.
Thank you, Program Director, President of IAGRA, Delfuga, distinguished guest. It is a great honor and privilege to address you this morning. In terms of the outline, I would start looking at the impact of the change in Panta profile on the gross gaming revenue in South Africa. I'll look at the drivers of sports betting growth in the rest of the continent. We'll look at the smartphone adoption in Africa, and the product improvements which drive this change in which underpin the change in the Panta profile, and how this impacts on the regulators. The gaming market in Africa, particularly South Africa, remains competitive. Gambling operators, in order to grab a slice of gaming leisure spend and remain relevant to their customer, continuously provide new products, innovations and ideas in the delivery of games. As a result of these developments, the gambling landscape is rapidly changing for all stakeholders, whether you are a regulator, you're an operator, or a punter. The rapidly changing face of gambling activity leaves regulators with the unenviable task and the daunting task of ensuring that these developments occur within the framework of policy, legislation, and that they do not undermine regulatory objectives. If we look at the graph that is depicted there, it shows a comparison of gross gaming revenue across all modes of gambling in South Africa, excluding lottery. If you look at the graph of significance, in 2010, casinos accounted for 84.4% of gross gaming revenue across all modes. And then betting, which is sports betting and horse racing, pari-mutuel, accounted for 9.9% of gross gaming revenue. But if you look at the trend in 2017, casinos have dropped to 66.4%, and sports betting has almost doubled to 18.9%. Now, if this trend continues in 2018 and the years thereafter, it has a significant impact on the gambling industry. particularly to the key stakeholders. I'll start with the punter. From a punter's perspective, it provides an opportunity for choice and gambling products that satisfies the needs of all punters, whether you're young or old. From the operator's perspective, it creates a mixed bag. For bookmaking sector, it will create an opportunity for investment, for growth, and to increase revenue. Whilst for the casino sector, the impact is going to be negative. If you look at the casinos, they've incurred substantial investments in developing these palatial emporiums. That one of them is the ones that you were in. So what it means for them is that they either may not be able to get their return on investments, they may have to go under. Alternatively, they may have to step up their game, provide relevant products, or alternatively, swallow the smaller business players, which creates monopoly. For government and policymakers, if we step back and look at prior to 1994, the only form of gambling in South Africa was horse racing. Casino games were only allowed in the self-governing states called the TBV states, Transkei, Ciskei, Venda, and Bophuthatswana. When the democratic government took office in 1994, on the advice of the Vian Commission, it decided to liberalize gambling and introduce other forms of gambling. Now, the key objective of regulating gambling were, amongst others, the creation of employment, the promotion of tourism. So the privilege of a license of a casinos, you are required to invest substantially to deal with government challenges of unemployment. Hence, you don't see casino facilities consisting of machine dens. There are other non-gaming facilities. Those are by design. You've got hotels, you've got conventions that are in place. Now this growth, if this trajectory continues, those government objectives are going to undermine. And then as policymakers, we're going to have to look at it. It is generally known that the online environment does not create significant jobs. However, it does create technical jobs. So we'll have to look at how do we deal with this phenomenon. If we look at what drives the growth in sports betting in Africa, we've got a youthful population and high level of unemployment. Africa has the youngest population in the world. We've got about 20 million people aged between 15 and 24. In some countries, the official unemployment rate is between 25 and 27, which is way above the average in developed countries. The next reason for the growth in development, it's the addiction that comes with sports betting. The value proposition for sports betting, you can bet for as little as $1 with a prospect of winning $50. So that creates a potential for addiction, and that's what drives the growth in sports betting. The third issue is the lax in sports betting laws. As Europe and America are improving on the regulation control of sports betting operators, they start moving towards the developing countries like Africa and South Africa. The fourth issue that drives growth in sports betting is the enthusiasm in sports. Africans, they love sports. So the combination of gambling with the sport, with sports, that's also one of the drivers of growth in sports betting. If we look at the attributes of young people, the millennials, they like to be in charge. They like to be in control of the game. They are conscious. So sports betting and some of the products that are introduced in sports betting, like betting, writing, etc., they tend to engage the player, and that appeals to the younger generation. So that's one of the factors that drives. And next to it, if you look at how gambling products are now being offered in sports betting. There's betting across all channels. You've got retail for the older generation, you've got mobile, you've got internet. So that sort of creates an ideal environment for the millennials. The other issue is that when you look at the young people, they prefer instant gratification, and sports betting provides that opportunity with the engaging continuous betting. The last one is the growth in internet penetration and widespread of use of mobiles in Africa. If you look at the graph there, although the smart adoption in Africa is below the global average, in 2015, the rate was 25%. It grew to 37% in 2017, almost double. And it is projected that in 2020, it will grow to 57% against the global average of 66%. If we zoom closely in Africa, particularly in sub-Saharan, the research indicates that 54% of the youth, they've gambled. And if we look at, in terms of who are the leading countries, in Kenya, 76% of the youth, followed by Uganda at 57% and Ghana at 42%. And if we zoom specifically on the use of mobile phones, Kenya comes tops at 96%, and South Africa at 48%. If we look closely at what happened in Kenya, what drives those numbers, there's a product called M-Pesa, which is a small value electronic payment and store value accessible from ordinary phones. It was launched in 2007 by Safaricom mobile network operator. It's used by over 17 million Kenyans, 2/3 of the population. So it accounts for 25% of the country's GDP. The same product was launched in Tanzania, Afghanistan, and India. So those who were in the yesterday's session will understand why Mr. James Maid of GLI could not resist the temptation of having a stopover in Kenya to travel across the length and breadth of the country. If we move to what are the product improvements and how these affect us as regulators, the first issue is in-play betting. Because of the risk and the potential for nefarious activities, regulators are faced with the challenge of deciding whether do we allow this activity, this innovation, because people bet in between the player, and in-play betting does not affect the outcome of the event or the market, but there's a risk that those with nefarious ideas might engage in the activity. And how do we embrace innovation without undermining our regulatory objective? The second issue is the increase in online and mobile betting. As regulators, we're expected to understand, improve our skill profile, our inspectorate to ensure that they're able to conduct the necessary audit within these environments. Thirdly, we've seen the migration from single bets to multiple bets. Now, this phenomenon, it's linked to somebody who can bet for $1 with a likelihood of winning a substantial amount of money. From a regulatory point of view, how do we deal with the risk of overstimulation of latent demand for gambling, given this innovation? The fourth issue is the use of affiliates. These are service providers who provide certain key activities on behalf of the licensed operator, and they do not have a license. The issue is, should we license them? Should we allow them to engage with punters without having a license? Should we ban them? How do we adopt a uniform approach across regulatory fraternities in regulating the incidence of affiliates? advertising. The modern way or channels of advertising, they now include Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. As regulators, we don't have control over regulatory activities in this media. For example, how do we ensure that gambling advertisement does not target the youth? We don't have control over this media. These are some of the challenges that we face and that may stimulate latent demand. The next one is the new payment methods. FATF, which is the Financial Action Task Force responsible for promoting best practice in the regulation and control of anti-money laundering throughout the world, has published a position paper to try and deal or alert with the risk associated with this new payment method, which include third-party funding, the exploitation of the non-face-to-face new method of payments, cryptocurrency, how do you ensure the integrity of those transactions, and the challenges on anti-money laundering strategies. Next issue is the cross-border transaction, the nature of online and mobile. Unfortunately, certain aspects of the gaming operations will reside outside your border. There's issues of how do you deal with cloud. Do you go public? Do you profit? What are the risks associated with that? Do we as regulators have the capacity to appreciate and understand the risks related to this innovation? The next one is we see a common development where bookmakers are offering bets on the outcome of the lottery. Now, the risks include, is an average punter aware that is he betting on lottery or is he betting on fixed odds? How do we ensure that there's no straddling of legislation? As, for example, in South Africa, different licenses are based on different product offerings. The next one is the evolution of esports. As the name suggests, it means, it stands for electronic sports. It is a competitive multiplayer video gaming whereby players and teams compete in leagues and tournaments using their skills to win money prizes. The challenges for us as regulators, the participants are young. How do we ensure that young participants do not indulge in gambling? Secondly, as the reason for our existence as regulators, it is to ensure fairness and integrity of game. In relation to esports, how do we ensure there's fairness amongst the participants? The consoles, the gadgets that are used to participate in the game, how should we ensure that those gadgets are tested to ensure that one is not designed or configured in a way that it gives advantage to another? And obviously the issue of stimulation of gambling among the youth. So if you look at the esports growth projection, in 2015 there were no users for esports, and hence the revenue and handle was both zero. From then on, the handle and revenue grew, and in 2017 it was $6 million and the revenues were below $6 million. It is projected that in 2019 both the handle and the users will be above 12 million. In 2020 the handle will be close to 24 million, while the users will remain under 18 million. So as regulators, we cannot afford to ignore the evolution of esports. So as I've indicated, we'll have to look at, do we license the operators? Do we license the equipment and devices? Do we look at the entire network in its entirety? In conclusion, millennials are a critical component of current and future customer base, and the industry cannot afford to take blind risks with the leisure time by ignoring them. The challenge brought about by these changes in the customer profile requires collaboration and increased alignment between key role players, namely the industry, regulators, and lawmakers. Thank you.
morning. It's difficult to come after Edward's presentation, because it also touched on some of the things that I wanted to talk about. In South Africa, the industries, our industry is a legitimate industry, heavily regulated, and every one of us here is a regulator, so it's testament to what we are trying to achieve. This panta, nevertheless, is evolving, and the protection of pantas is fragmented. It's not really, because for us, we find that the regulators are talking about the protection of the panta. The operator is looking at his side of business. How can he leverage that panta to get more people coming into gamble? Right. So each jurisdiction has its own way of handling that protection of the panta. In South Africa, the onus is mostly on the operator more than on the regulator. Then you find other jurisdictions, it's more on the regulator than on the operator. Then the profile of the panta now, what's driving this change in the panta? You will find that there's the aspect of the economical aspect, then you've got the technological aspect, then you have the generational change aspect. So we'll start with the economical side. Right. Growth of legal gambling in recent decades has been largely fueled by the acceptance of the communities that gambling can be good for the community. It provides employment. There's also revenue generated and taxes that can be used in other sectors of the economy. So from what Edward has said, previously gambling was very limited, and I'm sure in other jurisdictions as well, gambling was not an accepted entertainment. It was looked down at, but now communities are accepting it to say, yes, we can actually benefit, but within reason, right? So that's from the communities. Then you have the manufacturers and the operators. They also look at the client or the panta and say, we can also make business while the community is benefiting. I, as an operator, I also have to benefit, right? So because of that, and the demand from the panta now is that he wants more or she wants more. So the operator has to provide more so that you bring in more people, not just to gamble, but you also have to create entertainment for them. So previously you would find that basically it was you go, you gamble, you smoke, you drink. But now as we move, the operators are bringing in more products so that you don't just focus on the gambling aspect only. Right. And then there's also the media aspect, which comes in now, where people see more. Gambling becomes, I would say, when we advertise, it becomes glamorous in a way, right? But all that is driven now also by the income that people have. You find in some of our countries, like here in South Africa, you find that most of the low-income people tend to play lotto because it looks like, from the adverts and all that, it looks like they have a higher chance of winning something huge. You see the jackpot of 25 million. Then from that perspective, people will go and buy more tickets. Then you have the casinos They also come up with their jackpots. You see the nice adverts. So all that plays part in the economical side where people consider gambling. Then we have the technological aspect. Now, this is where our biggest challenge is as regulators. How are we challenged? What do we regulate? Do we regulate technology or do we regulate gambling? Can we separate technology from gambling when we regulate? Is technology developing for gambling, or technology is just developing outside of gambling, and gambling is adopting and adapting to that technology? That's the big challenge that we have as regulators. Right. So now the profile of the punter, due to that change, the punter is not isolated from the community, is not really a product of gambling. So technology comes in, and right now the improvement in broadband access to the internet has created an opportunity in our industry for people to gamble more, and for product manufacturers to come up with more products that people now can easily access. Where I would have to get into my car, drive to a casino, or phone a bookmaker. I don't have to do that anymore with the developments that are there. Technology is coming to me. Right. The casino is coming to me sitting in my living room. Right. So the profile of the punter then changes, because the punter has got more things to look at. Technology is making a lot of things come to them sitting at home. No one goes. How many people still want to go to a movie house? I can get the movie sitting at home. I can select what I want. I get easily bored. I watch one movie for 10 minutes, skip, go through and watch it for 10 minutes, which is a movie for 1 hour, 30 minutes, simply because I've got that ability. So that's what technology is doing to us in the gambling industry. It's giving that ability to the punter. So the punter's profile is changing from the guy who would get into his car and drive to a casino and gamble, or the guy would have to phone the bookmaker. Now all he has to do is get his phone, log in, create an account, and they can gamble. The provider of the gambling facilities can now actually say, okay, I don't have to build a casino. I can only invest in a few servers here, get someone to host them for me, then I can have clients. So now, where do we come in as regulators? How do we regulate that? That's the big challenge that's coming with this change of punter profile. So the other examples that are there, like here in South Africa, we had, for example, bingo. People played it the traditional way. But changes, someone being creative, bingo can be boring for me anyway, or for most people. It's just a case of tapping numbers on a piece of paper. Someone decides we put bingo on a gambling machine, but still that will still be boring to a punter. This is someone who has got an attention span which is very short because there are other things that distract me. So they create the entertainment part. Now you have a bingo component with reels running, and it looks interesting to someone. So the growth then for us in South Africa has been phenomenal because of the EBTs. And you find that the investment in the traditional bingo is going down because of that. Because the punter, the profile of that punter has changed. You have a punter who is interested, like Edward said, who needs instant gratification. So technologies is actually the big disruptor now in our industry. Then you also have the generational shift. We have got different generations, even in here. the way we use technology, the way we understand it, is also different. The way we look at gambling, if we take the younger people and we take the mature people, not the old people, you will find that even the way we look at the legislation is slightly different. The way we look at regulations is slightly different. The way we want the regulations to change or to evolve is also different. So we have that already as regulators, we have that clash. Right. So, but the operator who has a client to satisfy is going to look at that change in generations to say, okay, this is the older generation, this is what they wanted. But now there's a new group of people coming in, which is larger, and I have to satisfy that group. And that group is demanding more of the operator. They are not just interested in going and gamble. Some of them don't even care about gambling, but they want to go to the casino because there are there's other entertainment there. So the operator now looks at that punter and say, the profile of my customer has changed. I have to add more so that they come in. I may not be interested in gambling, but I'll come here because there's a movie house. I bring my family. Maybe I want to go and play a few games. My family is eating somewhere, or they are watching a movie, or there's entertainment for the kids. So these are all the things that now show that the punter that we had before and the punter that we're going to have in the future, or that we're having now, there's a transition caused by that. So different generations have different needs. But as operators move on, and us